Enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.
Welcome to And Good Company. I'm Sarah Fiedelholtz. We all know a great dinner party isn't really about the food. It's about the people seated around the table engaging in lively discussion. And Good Company gives you a seat at the table to enjoy smart and interesting conversations as they happen. I am pleased to be in the company of Reverend Angelo Mante, who is the Executive Director of the Alive Community Outreach. Welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So what I want to talk about to start with, with Alive Community Outreach, is what exactly happened on September 13th, 2016, that really set you on a path to return to Fort Wayne and on this path of the Alive Community Outreach and Peacemaker Academy?
Well, I'm from Fort Wayne, born and raised, was down in Atlanta for 8 years, went to school down there, was really enjoying my career and ministry down there. We were planting roots. We went down with one child, had 3 more while we were there, fell in love with it. And one morning, that morning on September 13, I was getting ready to go to the gym, our local YMCA, and I got this text message. It was 6 in the morning. I don't normally get text messages at 6 in the morning, and it was from a friend who's a college buddy of mine, and he asked me, he said, "Isn't your cousin's name Nick Powers?" And my heart just sunk at that moment. I knew this couldn't be good, getting a text like this at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I knew that my cousin, Nick, had some challenges. He had been in and out of prison and was struggling to reorient back into society, and I knew this wasn't good, and so I ended up contacted family and found out that he was shot and killed. He was murdered. It was a triple shooting down at a bar just right down the street from where we are right now on Wayne Street. And it was one of those things that, I had some friends from high school that I was close with that were killed when I was in college, and that hit me, but never anything like this, a family member like this. He was like a little brother to me growing up. And so I came back to Fort Wayne to attend the funeral, and the pastor that was supposed to do the funeral ended up backing out last minute, and I officiated the funeral last minute. And one of the hardest things easily that I've ever had to do, but I had to disconnect in a sense from the fact that this is my blood, because I had a task that I had to do. But even that day, as I stood in the funeral home, I knew that it's time to come home. And I didn't know what that meant. I just felt like we had already been following the violence that year. That was, to this day, 2016, that was the record for homicides in the city. And we had been following that already from afar. And then for it to touch our family, I went back to Atlanta, and my wife and I had the conversation and prayed a lot. And we said, we got to go back home to Fort Wayne. And so within a few months, we were making plans to come here, and we had a lot of support from my conference. I'm a United Methodist minister, and so the Indiana conference brought us here. They put me in a congregation for a year, and that was a year to kind of figure things out. What are we going to do here? It didn't feel like my call to come back here was just to be a pastor in the traditional sense. But there's something else. And so it was a year of discernment. We got to know a lot of families who've been affected by homicide, getting to know their stories, really getting a better understanding of the impact and the ripple effects from each homicide, and especially how many kids fall through the cracks and aren't even, there are a lot of great services in the community that already exist, but how many children were falling through the cracks and not receiving those services for one reason or another. A lot of barriers. And so it was during that year that this vision for Alive started to take shape, and really around initially supporting families who'd been affected by homicide. And so we started support groups. We started to take kids to places like Aaron's house, connecting families with different resources and counseling, and started to raise some funds to provide some limited financial assistance where that didn't already exist in the community. And so that's where we started, but then we said, okay, this is something that we feel that we're called to do, to support families and to try to, not just for a short period of time in the aftermath of a homicide, but really be there as a long-term support network for them. We're called to do this, but how can we work toward, or what can we do to work toward a community where there are less families to care for like this in the first place? And so that's where the whole nonviolence piece came in. I'm very passionate about nonviolence. Had a lot of interaction in my own education with nonviolence down south in Atlanta. And then I went down to Selma, Alabama just a couple of years ago and went through this intensive training down there and saw the impact that nonviolence is having in their community. And so we said, this is something we really want to bring back back home to Fort Wayne. And so Peacemaker Academy came a little bit later.
Right. And the truth of the we is that you work with your wife.
Yes.
Right. So and her name is
Marie.
Marie. So we got to give credit that that's the truth, that behind every great good man is a great woman. So, but you're really working together. There is the we of that.
Oh yeah. So, I mean, and even in the decision to come back home, and that's a whole other story. I mean, we came back. We didn't have a job lined up initially in Fort Wayne, and so we told the agency that I worked for a children's home in Georgia as a campus minister. We had to tell them that we were leaving before we had something lined up here. And we didn't have a home to move into, so our family of 6 and our German Shepherd, moved in with my brother and his wife here. And so there was a lot of that, so it was definitely a big leap of faith that our whole family and our children, I think, deserve a lot of credit as well in this whole process.
So you talk about the idea of sort of looking at where this idea of nonviolence is the idea of how violence steals, kills, and destroys a community.
Yes.
And this cycle of injustice. So can you talk to me about that and what is that cycle, and tell me what happens? Like, give me the ripple effect of like for a homicide, how that affects the family and then the community.
Well, one of the insights that came to me, that just dawned on me when I was at the funeral, my cousin's funeral, was that I looked out from the pulpit and there were all these young kids, 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, that have been to as many homicide funerals already in their lives. My cousin had a couple of people just within his close, circle of friends who were killed that same year. And so when you're 5 years old and 6 years old and you've been to 5, 6 murder funerals, and every year there's somebody that you're connected to, that your family's connected to, it starts to create a really bleak vision of the future, for you and for your community. And so, and I've worked with some families that, had the mentality that, the stigma in terms of mental health and trauma, and, have you thought about counseling, for your child? And, my baby's okay, they don't need that.
Right.
And so there's that to overcome. And so you have these traumatic losses that end up getting bottled up, and eventually come out in some ways. And sometimes that repeats itself as violence, sometimes, and not just violence in the sense of toward others, but even internally, right? And how people cope and deal with those kind of losses. And so the cycle repeats itself in a lot of different ways. But I think just the ongoing trauma of not just the personal losses, but within the community, it has this effect of, every time that there's a loss like that, there's some triggers that come along with that. Every time there's gunshots, we hear gunshots in our neighborhood, and there are times when I hear a gunshot and then I immediately think of my cousin, you know.
Right.
And,
Right.
and
No,
so,
well, they found that, I mean, it's these kids especially, it's post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, but it's not just, when you have to look at violence, it's not just, and this is probably why you moved away just from homicide, because they see violence. I mean, there's domestic violence, and there's, you know, misogyny, and there's child abuse, and, you know, the lack of respect that parents have for their children, and, you know, all of these types of violences. So it's not, I mean, obviously, the ultimate would be, you know, a gun, somebody, you know, but somebody could lose their life, you know, with a baseball bat. I mean, so you have to look at all of these types of violences, and there is a lot. I mean, and it has been proven that the recidivism of families, of somebody who grew up in you know, because you sort of foster what you grew up with. So if they, you know, if that's how they learned how men treat women, or, you know, that it's acceptable to not do things, then that's how they're going to be. So there is that repeating of this cycle that also has to be broken.
Yeah, and I think it's a real sensitive topic, because when you're working with children, young children, there is data that shows that unresolved trauma, particularly due to or related to violence, whether it was violence that was done to them or witnessed, or that they were affected by losing somebody, there's data that shows that those children are at greater risk someday or at some point of becoming offenders. But that's a real sensitive topic, right? Because when you're working with young children, you don't want to go in with that mindset that, oh, these kids are going to become violent someday if we don't do something, or save them somehow.
Right.
Because there are many kids that don't fall into that category. But
that goes to really evaluating a child's grit, resilience, determination. I mean, that's sort of your, you know, what your personality is, if you're going to be, how you'll respond to it. But regardless, it's going to impact you in some way. I mean, it may be at a different degree.
Yeah.
So when you talk about, though, trying to create a nonviolent community or way to deal with conflicts, right? But part of the problem is that it's also within, you have to start with, like you talk about, you know, the education. But if you live in a community where the educational system is against you from the beginning and doesn't get the same quality, or you don't have the same resources, or you don't have the same opportunities, or, you know, and then, you know, it's like such a big task to create this, because there's so many problems that you have to look at before you can even deal with with the violence itself, because you have to look at what was the cause of the violence and where did that come from, right?
Right.
So, I mean, I don't know, how do you even start with this? Like, because it just seems to me so monumental.
Right.
So you obviously picked that you were going to start with creating a program for high school kids, right? With the Peacemaker. So that's where you decided you were going to start. Is that true?
This is true.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
with Peacemaker Academy.
Right.
So we're doing other
right, because
work,
with Alive, you do youth violence intervention, and you do community education, and you do co-victim care.
The intervention hasn't, that'll be next year.
Okay.
But yeah, the nonviolence training in the community, it extends beyond Peacemaker Academy, and then the victim care.
So Peacemaker Academy came out of sort of you're looking at how to curtail the problem of violence happening, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So you decided. So really, Alive has only been. So you really only been. How old is Alive? Only like.
So 2019, we had a grant from the Indiana Conference, the United Methodist Church. We were under the umbrella of the conference for that 1 year to get our ducks in a row and figure out what are we going to do. We became our own nonprofit on January 1st. 2020, which is a great year to start a nonprofit, by the way.
Right.
So, in case you didn't know.
Right. So, so really, we're talking really less than a year.
Yep.
So you decided to sort of say, okay, we're going to create this Peacemakers Academy, and we're going to deal with high school. So tell me the thought process and how it came about.
So in 2019, we after I went to Selma, Alabama. and went through that training down there, I got connected to this whole network of people doing nonviolence work, not just nationally, but internationally.
Right.
And there was one group that really intrigued me out of Chicago. And I kept hearing different people talk about this and say, you need to talk to them. And so it's a nonprofit called the Addie Wyatt Center. And they do nonviolence training, working with high school kids. And we started to learn the story of how they started. So there was a teacher at a school called North Lawndale College Prep, and she had been doing some nonviolence work. I think it was a club that she had, and but then the school, the administration, eventually bought into this. They saw this great stuff that was happening with this siloed group of students, and then it grew from there, and they made some really radical decisions. So it's an area that has a lot of issues with violence.
Right, because it's really, I mean, Lawndale is one of the second worst areas on Chicago.
Oh, you lived in Chicago.
I lived in Chicago.
Okay, so yeah.
So it's the second worst area of on the south side of Chicago.
So are you familiar with the school?
Yeah.
So they made some really radical choices. It's not that big of a school, but they had, I think they had 10 officers work in the school. They had metal detectors. All of this amounted to about $500,000 a year.
Right.
They got rid of all of it. They got rid of the officers. They got rid of and the officers there was, in Fort Wayne, it's a little bit more, a different model here. There was to police the schools.
No, it was to police the schools.
Metal detectors, got rid of all of that. Created a completely different culture and where peace was the expectation. My favorite thing that they do is they have celebrations at 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 120 days, and then if you make it to 150 without a physical altercation, they shut the block down.
But it's based on the whole school.
Based on the whole school.
So it's also getting other people, like, because if you're at day 148
and you see something
you're
about to go
going to
down,
be like, don't you dare, because we're going to get
right.
So it becomes. But what was it that they did? Tell me what was it that the school...
There were a number of things that they did. So they did that. They ended up bringing on somebody that's their full-time job, to build a culture of peace in the school.
Right.
Nonviolent education became
the accepted.
Right.
But they set the standard. They set the bar high.
Yes, absolutely. They set the bar high. They
and
let them know, you're coming in. If you're coming in and we're greeting you with metal detectors, what that communicates is we expect you to have a weapon with you.
Exactly.
Right? A weapon on you. And so we're not going to do that. We're going to have staff giving kids high fives. Hey, glad you're here.
Right.
You know, and so they have that type of energy.
Right. It's the fundamental of, like, when I taught. Okay, I always used to say to the students, everyone gets an A. Everyone has an A in this class right now. My job is to help you keep that A. That's a very different approach than you have to earn an A.
Yeah.
Because you start with the idea, you've all got the A.
Right.
So you just got to do the work so you can keep it. And so then you don't have to earn my respect and trust. And so it switches the mentality of what the expectation is, and then what is your job.
I like that.
See, so it really does flip the switch for the kids, because they don't have to feel like, oh, I'm going to fail. Like I don't know you. Everybody has an A.
I had a graduate school professor that on day one, he said, just want to let you know, nobody gets an A in my class. I like your approach better.
Right. But see, but that's the difference. So if you say, we are going to be a nonviolent school, but okay, so it's easy to say it.
Right.
But how do you get them to do it?
Education, right? So peace education became part. So they actually had formal trainings, like what we're doing with students.
Right.
They had art was another big thing. Everywhere you go, there are messages of peace all over the place.
Right.
They implemented things like peace circles, right? So if there's a conflict, it doesn't go from, so one of the things we talk about is levels of conflict. So there's the normal level, then there's what we call the pervasive level, when things start to get, and then there's the full-blown overt physical violence eruption. So before it gets anywhere close to that point, they're getting students together, they're talking, and not just an adult sitting there with them, but peers are very much a part of this mediating process with students. And so it took a while. Honestly, I think we're beyond now where they were in the begining, because the administration at Southside has really bought into
so
this.
okay, yeah.
But so it took them a while, but over 7 years, over a 7-year span, they reduced fights by 90%. So that's pretty significant. And violence in the area, and this is another thing that we're trying to say, okay, well, what's the relationship or the connection between what we can accomplish in the school, what are the ripple effects of that in a positive way out into the greater community? And that's probably a longer term.
Right. Or it could
goal.
be shorter if people started looking at schools as being the community center and the hub for the neighborhood, and that everything comes from the schools, as opposed to like for parents feeling they're being called to the principal's office, or
Perhaps it hasn't had that effect in Lawndale,
right.
but we're not Lawndale.
Right.
We're not Lawndale. Yeah.
So the idea was that you saw this program and you said, okay, we're going to test this in Fort Wayne. So you created a pilot program, okay, and you just completed this.
Well, we visited them, by the way, too.
Right, no, so you saw it, and so you said, okay, you learned best practices, and then you said you're going to do this pilot program.
Yes.
And you chose Southside High School because they had increased the violence is more pervasive on the southeast side, and
yeah, and that's something else I want to be really careful about, because there's not a worse problem of violence at Southside High School. It's that there's a high concentration of students at Southside who are affected by violence.
By nature of
and we were already, through the City Life Center, we were already doing some nonviolent students with some Southside leaders there, and so there was that connection too. So it just made sense to start.
Although I joke that I'm on a mission that I want people to stop referring to Southeast as the South Side, because I think that the students should rally that the school should not be called South Side, because sides to me, like when people talk about North Side, I feel like I'm in West Side Story, and it's the gangs.
Right.
So they actually, I think it should be South High School, because we're not taking sides. It's not one side is better than the other. So I think, again, to me, that's mindset. So I think that the students
take pride in that, though.
But they still can, because that's location.
Right.
But not saying you're taking a side, that you're different and therefore we can't get along. And our school, like the schools in South.
That's how people talk, though. If they say where you live, they don't say I live south. They say I live on the south side.
But words matter.
Yeah,
and
I
if
agree.
you get people to talk more about they live in a neighborhood than a side, then they're building pride. I just think this word side creates this you against me. And so this is my own personal mission. So
Put it in the suggestion box.
Well, I think that the students, this should be part of their program. So, so you had 12 students.
Yes.
And you really were intentional about the students you chose to do this program. So what was it that you were looking for in the students?
We're looking for leaders, for kids that are, and when we talked to guidance counselors and the principal, and we said we're looking for leaders who are leading in positive ways, and maybe some that are leading in not so positive ways, because I was one of those kids when I was in high school, right? And so, and there were some adults that saw that leader underneath all the other stuff.
Well, because those leaders, they lead gangs, or they lead the groups that bully, and I mean they lead. Leader is a leader.
High school, that's the movie, The Principal, with Belushi, right? Yeah, I mean these. So if you're not tapping into that leadership, then you're missing the boat. If you're just open to kids that are really already doing awesome. Now it ended up being that those were the kids that we had primarily with Peacemaker Academy, kids that are already really stepping up and doing things, but we were and continue to be open to kids that are.
Well, and also you want the kids maybe that are influencers, not leaders,
Yes.
Because there's also an issue that not everyone can be a leader. We also need to teach people to be good followers, because, or make the choice of who to follow.
I agree with that. I don't think that's a popular opinion, but I agree with that.
Well, because not everybody can lead.
And I think everybody can lead in some ways, but in terms of those who are really going to be the influencers, that's not everybody.
Well,
And
everybody
that's
can
okay.
have a circle of influence. They may not
Right,
be a leader.
right.
So okay, so you had this program, and it was a 3-week program. Now, what surprised me was that you paid them.
Yes.
And they got $750
Yes,
to do this for 3 weeks. So one thing I want to know is, out of the 12, how many completed the program?
12.
And by the end, I'm sure at the beginning, they all were like, oh, they want the $750. I mean, so then that's probably the most money they've ever seen, right?
So this was the $1 million question for us before the academy started. We went through the interview process, we had the references, the application, all of that. The students did awesome, all of them. We were blown away by their interviews. Not a single one of them mentioned anything about the pay or the money. We were the ones to bring that up. And a couple of them were like, oh, okay, that's great, and then a couple of them were like, oh, really, that's awesome. Like, they didn't know this going into the process. But still, we didn't know until we get in this room with them. Are they going to engage? Is there going to be an element, are there going to be some students who are here for that reason, that this is their primary incentive? And every student engaged from the get-go. No one mentioned anything about the pay, about that part of it as an incentive for them joining the program. Not a single one of them. And so
So going forward, do you think you're going to continue that aspect of it, though?
Yeah, I do. Because that we talked about this a lot, and this is one thing that we did get from the Addie Wyatt Center, that they pay students to be a part of their summer institute, is what they call it. If we want leaders, a lot of times these kids are the ones who have a lot of initiative. They're going out and they're working summer jobs, they're doing things in the summer, they're staying busy, right? So,
or they have to work during the summer, so they can't take advantage of doing these types of programs.
So if there's a way for us to continue to do that, to be able to add that incentive to say, you don't have to choose this program that's not going to pay you anything, but love and knowledge, valuable love and knowledge, right?
Right.
But Walmart or McDonald's, they're giving you something tangible in your hand that you can do whatever you need to do with. So I think that's definitely something that we want to continue to do.
So over this 3 weeks, they sort of learned the framework of peacemaking and nonviolence, and then they had to do a project, right? So what was the group project that they came up with?
So the first week we go through the curriculum, we teach them the framework. That was always really clear. We had a really clear plan for that first week. And then it was like, let's see how this goes. The second week, we had a lot of speakers come in, and we started to zoom in at the local context of Fort Wayne and issues of violence and root issues, and then started to zoom in a little bit further into Southside. And that was really fun because students, they got to think through what the weaknesses are, issues of violence, at their school. And when we talk about violence, we're talking about broadly.
Right.
So not just fights, but what are
it could be bullying or being picked on.
Bullying, sexual harassment. I mean, you name it. There are lots of issues that they filled up a whole huge piece of paper with these issues, multiple pieces of paper. But then you take these things together and you start to dream, and each student did this individually. 10 years from now, what do you want this school to look like? What do you want your impact to be on this school? What does the ideal Southside high school look like? And then we came together and started to think through this, and they created this dream for 10 years from now. So now the question is, where do we start? And there were a number of project ideas that the students had, but as we talked through all these different ideas with them, we said, we really have to, and the students felt this way too, we have to build our foundation for who we are, and to, rather than just working on one isolated project, we have to figure out, how to form a team or a committee or a board that can grow and can
make it sustainable.
And and give birth to many projects. And so we're meeting with them in a couple more weeks to talk through that, but it sounds like creating a board or committee of some kind is where they're at right now, and trying to figure out how to get what they're learning to the teachers, to the administrators. And actually today, and this is an example of the administration buying in, so Principal Swinford, he's showing, there was a video, and if you saw that, one of our students, she's a sophomore, created this awesome video, and he's showing that to the whole staff today in their staff meeting. And so how do we bring in some more teachers?
But you also got a very significant buy-in from the superintendent of Fort Wayne Community Schools. So tell me about that.
I mean, that was a really surprising, welcome, cool thing for me. I presented at Rotary Club when we announced this, and he stood up in the back. We hadn't had any interaction with him up to that point. We had with some of district leadership in just getting approval for the program. But to have him there and stand up and say, like, I think this is exactly what we need, and I'm behind this, was really mind-blowing.
So you had that you didn't need to prove it. It's like you started with the A. So that's it. So, but what, you talk about this idea of an intentional culture.
Right.
What is an intentional culture?
In general?
Well, in the sense for like these students, like in the work that you're doing in Peacemaker Academy. Because it sounds like to me what these students were saying to you is that they need to create the intent of what the purpose of what they're doing for their school. And they need to create that culture, and then you can have programs and initiatives that enhance or are outcomes of that culture. But if you don't have the culture, it won't make sense. So
so one of my favorite stories as it relates to nonviolence, so Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who worked very closely with Dr. King, he was with King at the Lorraine Motel on the day he was assassinated. He left, got on a plane to DC, landed, and found out that King had just been killed. And the last thing that Dr. King said to Lafayette, he wasn't a doctor at that time, he said, now Bernard, the next phase of the movement, we're going to really focus on internationalizing and institutionalizing nonviolence. And so this, and, Bernard was like, okay, that's great. I got to go catch my plane. We'll see you later. And he never did, of course. But this idea of institutionalizing nonviolence. How do you go from a club that's impacting 12 kids to this is part of our DNA. This is part of our culture. This is how we think about, not just how we go about these trainings, but this is how we think about discipline. This is how we think about everything that we do. Right. And so that's the goal. Right. Just so like with North Lawndale, how do you go from this teacher and this club to the whole school rallying around this idea of not just reducing violence, because I think that's an issue that we often talk about violence in that context of just reducing violence. So nonviolence it goes beyond just.
It's not violent.
So in our training, we actually make a distinction between non-violence and non-violence, all one word. So non-violence being just the negation of violence. If I go outside and somebody's getting beat down and I walk by, I'm being nonviolent because I'm not doing any violence.
Well, that's the difference between being bystanders and upstanders.
Yes. Absolutely.
I mean, that's the same thing. And you want people to do the right thing even if it's hard.
Right.
But partly, so when you talk about nonviolence, right?
Yes.
And you talk about the skills and the philosophy that it's based on, right? Is this holistic view of conflict and how you sort of approach and analyze conflict, and then how you sort of integrate into resolving conflict. But part of my whole feeling is that is there an increase in violence in some ways because we're not giving people the skills to be able to do what is required to be nonviolent? Like, we don't teach people to debate. Debate is based on fact, reason, and presenting an argument. It's not emotion. You're not trying to change someone's mind, okay? You're presenting your side of an issue. We don't teach how to critically reason or to think. So how do you put yourself in someone else's shoes? How do you understand where they're coming from? We don't talk about how to separate out emotion. we don't talk about, especially like if you look at the polarization in this country, has never been greater, and the rise of hatred and anti-Semitism is to these extremes, because I think people don't have the tools or skills to convey or express how they feel, or not feel but think, and therefore it escalates, because then it just becomes a shouting match. Like I always say, like if you're in an argument, like if someone any situation I'm in, and someone's upset, right, with something, so really the first thing I'll say to them is, tell me what I can do to make this better, right? So then most of the time they'll just stop, because what they really wanted, they just wanted you to hear that they didn't like how this server treated them, and they really don't want you to do anything. They just want acknowledgement. So sometimes if you just sort of ask the question, like, I understand you're upset and I agree with you, this was not, like you hear them, you acknowledge them, and just say, what can I do to make it better? But we don't teach people how to do that.
When you say we, what
the educational system, and the emphasis in our society of the value of these kinds of skills, and what we'd also call emotional quotient, people being more understanding, or being empathetic, or understanding why, like the root causes of violence, and why is it that African American teenagers are more likely, if they drop out of high school, are more likely that's the path to going to jail, is because of the system, and they don't get, no kid starts kindergarten hating school. Why is it by the time that they're in 5th or 6th grade, there's a propensity of African American boys who hate school? I just wonder, when you look at talking about these programs, but when you say, part of it is you have to look at the root causes, right?
Right.
So don't you think we have to take like 5 steps back to sort of figure this out? Or do you think that what you found with these students is that once they get into it, maybe they don't know what they're doing, but they're able to do these things?
I don't think it is this linear thing to where we have to do X, Y, and Z, and then we get to this. There are lots of complicated, so in an ideal world, our education system would be, we wouldn't need nonviolence education, right? It would be infused and incorporated into, and students would have the skills everywhere, to be able to analyze conflict at the root, whether we're talking about interpersonal conflicts that are happening in the schools, or larger social conflicts with the police and the black community and these larger, political issues that King was organizing around, obviously, by the way. So, but I think that at the same time, nonviolence and the type of programming that we're doing has had a profound impact in areas that don't have strong educational systems, even in prisons.
Right.
With people that, so I have a friend named Kazu who's doing work out in Oakland, California, and that's mostly what he does. He works in prison, and a lot of the men that he's working with are not highly educated, but they're able to see these big reductions in violence. And the prisoners, they take on these ideas and these concepts, and then they go and they train others. But it's not a matter, I think, when we're dealing with, there's some issues, and I hear what you're saying about like separating the emotion of conflict. I think that's possible with, depending on the level of conflict and depending on what it is that we're talking about.
Okay. But when you talk about like the skills of negotiation,
right,
that needs to be taught.
Yes. And that's part of what we're doing.
Right. So so you're finding that. Are you finding though that some of these things you have to fill in these gaps because they're not getting this kind of learning in a school setting that they would need in order to be nonviolent?
So the students that we had, and I'll just speak to the 12 students that came through Peacemaker Academy. They were, a lot of concepts that we're teaching them are new, but these are kids that are very bright and caught on very quickly and educated. Now, I think that there are
They're the leaders.
What's that?
They're the leaders.
They're the leaders. Now, there's some concepts that some of them hadn't heard about before, like we had got into when we were analyzing Fort Wayne. We talked about redlining. It was like, well, what's that? And so some of those areas, but I think a whole other conversation about education.
Right.
That is a whole other conversation, and even well, what is the totality of education, right?
Or the purpose of it.
Or the purpose of it, and is the only education setting that we talk about in those contexts the formal education? Because the whole community, all of community life is ultimately part of education.
Well, this is why my point of asking you, because so much is, I like Maya Angelou said, if they knew better, they would do better, okay? So much of what kids learn is from their home. And then also when they become teenagers, what they actually found is the greatest influence on their lives is their friends, not their parents.
Right.
But I sort of wonder, are you getting them too late? Like you're getting them when they're sophomores, juniors, and seniors in high school.
Yeah.
And do you need to get them when they are in second grade, or even in nursery school, where it's like, when I was a nursery school teacher, so if a child would grab a truck from another child, okay, children at that age think that everybody can read their mind. So if you had a truck and I just took it, I won't think there's anything wrong with it, because I would know that you understood that I was thinking I want the truck, and you would read that, and so I could take the truck. So partly what you have to do as a teacher is say, no, you don't know that I want the truck, and so I have to use my words to say to you, Angelo, could I have that truck that you're not playing with anymore? So from that age, you have to teach them how to use their words and negotiate, and then as they get older, that's why when kids are about, you probably experience this with your own kids, when they're about 7, and you ask them what they did in school today, so they say nothing. You say, what do you have? Nothing. Because what they've learned is that is the point when they go that if they don't tell you, you don't know. Until then, they think that you can read their mind. So they think you're omnipotent, and then they realize, oh, wait a minute, if I don't tell my dad, he won't know. And so partly though, but it starts at that age. So I'm just wondering if you think that, and because trauma and everything from when are you starting too late, or is the hope that you start at high school, but eventually you'll work down?
I mean, that's a good question, and I think the answer to the question is probably yes. I totally hear what you're saying.
And then also, I think you need to educate the parents, because a lot of violence is just the emotional abuse of how, and if a parent keeps telling you that you're worthless and you're not good and you're stupid, what are you going to start to believe?
Well, and I go back to how North Lawndale has kind of expanded what they're doing. So they were contacted by some middle schools, said, hey, could your students come and train our students? Because going back to the whole peer piece, with teenagers, the greatest influence is
their
one
friends.
Another. But like for a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old to have a 14-year-old or 15-year-old come and teach them nonviolence instead of this guy, like I think that's a lot more impactful. So I think that this is just the starting point. But if this is all we did, then it wouldn't be enough. But the other part of it is we're teaching this sort of this conflict reconciliation at the interpersonal level, which I think works really well with all age groups where we can do that. The other piece of this, though, which is our hope, is that these tools, these skills, this whole philosophy, which was birthed out of this social movement, right? The civil rights, that students Southside becomes this training ground,
the hub
hub where they can take these skills that they're learning, and then after they graduate, they can start to address these root issues. Dr. King talked about the 3 evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. Well, maybe these students, this next generation, if we just give them the skills and the tools, maybe they'll be the ones to come up with some solutions to some of the deeper issues that affects violence on a wider scale.
So based on the this pilot program, and now I know you've done the deep dive of value, what worked, didn't work, and you're sort of evaluating what's next. So is what's next, is it like, you have to keep going within the school. Like, you can't just leave them to their own devices, right? So you have to figure out, okay, how do we keep alongside these kids at Southside to continue the program? And then you also have to figure out, how do you roll this out? So what have you sort of decided? But first I want to ask you, what's the things you learned about this program that really, besides like the money thing, was a big surprise. What was another thing that you learned or that didn't work that you're going to change? Or
we learned a whole lot of things. So I think the degree to which it caught on, as quickly as it caught on, there were even questions as to whether or not we would be able to do this year. You know, we had conversations with the administration, and this has been a hard couple of years to get students engaged with a lot of things. This is just, you know, and so it's like, well, is this the best year to try to do something like this as a pilot, or should we wait until next year? The students that as applications started to pour in, and we had conversations with students, and that were really deep conversations, even in the interviews, just how hungry students are for this, how much they want to make a difference right now. And that's something that we talk a lot about. Like, adults are always telling kids, you're the future, you're the future. We're saying, yeah, you're the future, but you're the present.
Right, but we need to empower them.
Yes.
We need to give them the ability to, like, you know, if there is a conflict, like you talked about peace circles, or like give them sort of to be able to set up a document. Like, I had a sign at school, you know, an honor code, and everybody signed it. And so that wasn't only what I would do myself, but my responsibility to my classmates. But it came from us. We wrote it, you know, and what we would do. And so I think that's coming from the students, right? Those kinds of things.
Yes, and they were so, so we didn't have academy on Fridays, so they had 3-day weekends, so Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and they would come in Monday and talking about how they practice nonviolence, you know, at home, and how one of the mothers came up to me at the celebration and said, like, now this makes more sense to me, because like she had talked about some conflict that was about to emerge between her and her daughter, but her daughter was like acting weird and like different than normal and like handling it differently. She's like, now this makes sense. There was almost an altercation with a couple of our students on one of the days, and we did this peace circle process with them.
So they got to really see it in action. It wasn't just the ivory tower of talking about this is all good.
No. This became very real at this moment for these two students, and they were able to internalize what they had been learning, and they were like best friends for the rest of this academy. And so, like, to see this go from this sort of academic exercise of teaching these concepts was powerful. The degree to which students opened up in our larger peace circles that we have, where we would go around and we would ask these really deep personal questions. And first couple days, some students are like, I'm good, I'll pass. But then as they got more comfortable, and as people became more and more vulnerable, including the facilitators, it created this really powerful space that we had high expectations for the whole thing, but there were a lot of, like, you know, when you're doing a pilot, you know, how's this going to go? I think that above all, we were surprised by how much went well and how much that we're not going to change. Now, next year, I think, in terms of what we might change, I think the second week and the third week, we might have a little bit more structure there, because we really wanted to put the power into the students' hands to be able to start to think about, you know, what the project that they wanted to take on. But I don't know. I think it ended up that organic, because I like to know where we're going, exactly what we're doing. But I think that there was a lot of good things that came out of having this more fluid, organic space too. So we're still very much processing this. And so as we're having this debrief this coming week with our full team, And there are a lot of decisions that are yet to be made. The biggest one being, do we continue to build the foundation at Southside and just do that, or do we add another school?
Well, my argument would be, why can't you do both?
Well, that's you know,
Right.
that's the dilemma. So I think that there's wisdom. We want to grow this,
Right.
but there's also wisdom in saying, okay, let's really get this right here.
And then how do you get the funding? Like, because the superintendent for Fort Wayne Community Schools said, okay, he believes in this, and
Yeah.
so does that help you, like, get the necessary funding to be able to roll this out? Or how do you roll this out? I mean, where's the money coming from?
That's a great question. Yeah, got any contacts for me? So that's part of this larger question for us right now with where we are, because there's Peacemaker Academy, and you know that this program for this year for this school costs $20,000.
Right, and you got that like through the Rotary and other grants,
Different
right?
bits, yeah,
Right,
pieces,
right,
yeah.
Right, but if the Fort Wayne Community School says, okay, they believe in this and want to do this, then can they help with that funding, or no? It's still, you have to find the outside funding for it.
I don't know yet. Yeah, I think that's a conversation that we need to have.
Or maybe bring it back to the kids
Bring it back to the kids to
say, what do we do? How
Yeah.
do we, I mean,
I would like for part of this for us to be able to help the kids have their own budget
right,
that they can do.
Right.
They can use at
Right.
their discretion for whatever they want to do
for
at
these
Southside.
programs. Because
Yeah.
I think, though, that some of the key things are, what I hear is empowerment,
Yeah.
respect.
Yes.
I mean, these are for the students, and
Yep.
giving them, a lot of education and like punishment in schools is all given to them, as opposed to them being like, that's why at colleges they have, peer review. Like if somebody has to go before the,
Yeah.
academic, it's a peer committee, and I had that in high school. It was a peer.
Well, there were lots of great ideas that they had, even in terms of discipline at the school,
Right.
and ISS was something that came up, and they were just exploding with all kinds of great ideas, and that goes back to this idea of institutionalizing, and how does some of these concepts become part of the DNA of the school and the way that the school operates across the board.
But do you think, because it's really, you're sort of breaking down the institution and rebuilding it, do you think that the teachers and the administrators and the whole system are really ready to do that? Or do you think that it's an easier thing to talk about, but then actually do?
We're so new right now in this relationship. It's been overwhelmingly positive with the administration and with in a school, and the way that schools are set up. It's all about the principal. It is, if the principal's on board, then people fall in line. But the conversations that we've had with other administrators and staff have been genuinely excited about this and open. Are you going to have people in any environment, whether we're talking about, I'm a pastor, and you
Right.
go to a new church and you have people that are on board, there are always going to be people that say, no, we should do it this way because we've always done it that way.
Right.
So I don't know that I don't think of this as necessarily like tearing down the institution and rebuilding, but like piece by piece, like what might we be able to do?
Slowly integrating,
Slowly integrating.
it's like renovating.
Sure, and I think if we can help to, the principals shared some metrics that they use as it relates to truancies and fights and referrals. Well, our students over here, they want to see those things go down too, and so that's kind of their task, to kind of build this connection between the administrators and the students and the teachers and
So
everybody.
it's basically, in some ways, it's bring them all together at the table. Everybody gets a seat at the table.
Yes.
And then what they realize is partly what a negotiation. If you realize that if you start a negotiation, it's the same thing with my everybody has an A.
Right.
If you start a negotiation believing that both of you want the most beneficial outcome, that for both of you. Now, nobody's going to get everything they want. So
Yeah.
if you walk both parties, you're not going to walk away 100% happy.
Right.
Okay, but if you start that you come to the table with a good intent,
Yes.
and you can trust the process, your ability to negotiate is very different. And it's the same, like if you come to the table with trust with for these students and what they're trying to do, and that you really are on the same side, then the negotiation will be very different.
Right. And so one of the concepts that we teach is an organizing concept called top down, bottom up. And so you have the top and those in power,
Right.
and then you have those at the bottom, which
Right.
may not be perfect language for describing
Yeah.
social dynamics. But in the school setting, you have
Top down.
the principal and the administration. At the bottom, you have the students,
Right.
and maybe break that down even further. You have the freshmen,
Right.
And so the nonviolent leader or the peacemakers, so they are trying to they're hearing the concerns of the students. They're communicating those concerns to the administrators.
Right.
There are all sorts of things that administrators are dealing with that students don't have any concept of, and so they're communicating back
Right.
and forth, but ultimately trying to work toward the same.
Right. What I say is the one skill that they don't teach you is, like, when they teach you to be a leader, they teach you to manage other people. But what they don't teach you is how to manage up. And what I have learned is the skill of how you manage the people above you so that they no longer
Yeah.
micromanage you, or they give you the freedom.
Yeah.
So you have to learn, so like for students, if they would learn to micromanage
Right.
the teachers and the administrators and understand what they need to get from these students,
Yeah.
so that then they feel like, okay, like I do, when I have a client, I do a weekly report.
Yeah.
And I tell
Yeah.
them what I did this week, what I'm going to do next week, and what I need from them. And so that way I'm managing up. Because if I'm working on something and they're paying me, but they're not going to see a result, right? They're going to be like, what is she doing all day? What are we paying her for? But
Right.
this way, so I'm managing up. So
That's
then
good.
they
I like
leave me
that.
alone. But nobody teaches this. And if you want to,
Important.
it's the best way, like even in relationships, if you just help manage other people's expectations, and what they really want is they just want to know what you're doing and that you understand what their concerns are. But also I intentionally put what I need from them, because a lot of times I can't do what they're paying me to do because somebody didn't do what they're supposed to do. But they'll blame me. But if I put it down there that I still need this, this, and this from you, then I'm saying to them, it's not my fault. You're not getting me. But we don't teach this. And it's one of the critical things that it's very successful, because then people don't micromanage you. They leave you alone. They know that you're giving them a report. They feel you're accountable, and they feel that it's measurable. Because
Yeah.
they can say, okay, she did all these things, and then next week she's going to do these. Great, she's working towards the goal. But we don't teach it.
That's good.
And so that's why I think some of these things you give them the tools, but we need to also give them the skills. But I do hope you'll come back, because I wanted you to do a whole exercise of nonviolence with me and have a negotiation and go through the steps.
Sure.
So I really hope we can do that, and
I'd
you'll
love
come
that.
back.
I'd love that.
But at the end of each And Good Company show, I ask guests the same 12 questions that French novelist Marcel Proust popularized in a Victorian parlor game. What is your favorite word?
Love.
What is your least favorite word?
Hate.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Nonviolence.
What turns you off creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Inauthenticity.
What sound or noise do you love?
My children laughing.
What sound or noise do you hate?
My children shrieking.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Ooh, videography.
What profession would you not like to do?
Police officer.
What do you consider your greatest achievement?
My family.
Who, living or dead, would you most like to have a conversation with?
Jesus.
How would you like to die?
Whew. In my home, in my sleep with family around me.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Welcome, come on in.
Well, you're welcome to come back anytime. And I
Thank
really
you.
do. I want you to come, and I want us to do a specific exercise of going through the steps
That'd be
of
fun. That'd be great.
nonviolence. So that
That'd
will
be
be great. So we will set a date for that.
Sounds good.
And you can learn more about And Good Company and all the other interesting conversations we have had at andgoodcompany.info. And we look forward to next week when you can again enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.